I'd never choose one. I liked all of them. They were all, to me, stars. I'm a fan of all of them. It was nice.
Anybody special?
No particular one. There are some particular ones, but I wouldn't say.
Charles Bronson was not a man who made things easy for people who needed him to be something he was not. That quality defined his screen presence as completely as it defined his personal life. He was granite, where other actors were polished marble, rougher, denser, more resistant to the kind of shaping and smoothing that the Hollywood machine applied to the people who passed through it. He had grown up in genuine poverty in a Pennsylvania coal mining town, one of 15 children, and had worked underground before finding his way into acting through a path that had nothing to do with privilege or connection. That background was not a story he performed for interviewers. It was the actual foundation of everything he became, and it made him almost constitutionally incapable of pretending that things were fine when they were not, or that people were admirable when they weren't, or that the industry around him deserved more respect than he actually felt for it. He became one of the biggest box office stars in the world during the 1970s, which is a fact that surprises some people given how little effort he appeared to make toward conventional likability. Death Wish turned him into a phenomenon. The Great Escape, The Dirty Dozen, Once Upon a Time in the West. A filmography that held up across genres and across decades, built on a screen presence that communicated danger and self-sufficiency without needing to announce either. Directors who worked with him described a man who showed up completely prepared, expected the same from everyone else, and had no patience whatsoever for the gap between those two things. Off-screen, Bronson was famously private, famously blunt, and famously uninterested in the social lubrication that the film industry generally requires from its participants. He did not cultivate relationships for strategic reasons. He did not soften his assessments out of professional courtesy. And across a career that spanned more than 4 decades, there were specific people whose conduct, attitudes, or fundamental approaches to the work produced in him a dislike that was real, documented, and in several cases expressed without particular concern for the consequences. What follows is an honest account of 6 of those people and the circumstances that shaped Bronson's feelings about them. Michael Winner directed Charles Bronson in 6 films between 1972 and 1999, a run that included Death Wish and its sequels, and that made the two men, on paper, one of the more commercially productive director-actor partnerships of their era. The films they made together were enormous moneymakers. Death Wish in particular became a cultural touchstone, a film that generated serious debate about vigilante justice and urban crime, and that established Bronson as a specific kind of American icon, the ordinary man pushed past his limits, taking justice into his own hands in ways that mainstream society simultaneously condemned and found deeply satisfying. By any commercial measure, the relationship between Bronson and Winner worked. By most personal measures, it was considerably more complicated. Winner was a director with a large personality, a sharp tongue, and a mode of operating on set that many people who worked with him found difficult to distinguish from bullying. He was loud, opinionated, dismissive of concerns raised by cast and crew, and relentlessly self-promotional in ways that tended to position his directorial vision as the sole meaningful creative force in any production he helmed. Bronson, who arrived on every set with his own clear and carefully considered ideas about his character and how scenes should be approached, found Winner's style of authority both professionally frustrating and personally grating. People who were present on their shared productions have described a dynamic that was functional but rarely warm. 2 strong personalities who needed each other commercially, but who coexisted with a friction that was visible to everyone around them. Bronson reportedly found Winner's treatment of crew members genuinely objectionable, in the specific way that someone who grew up working in physically dangerous conditions for minimal wages finds the casual mistreatment of working people offensive rather than merely unpleasant. He was not someone who separated his professional standards from his personal ones, and Winner's conduct toward the people working beneath him on the production hierarchy was something Bronson never fully accepted, regardless of the results the collaboration produced. What makes the relationship historically interesting is precisely that gap between the commercial success it generated and the personal reality underneath it. The Death Wish films made both men wealthy and famous in ways that the industry found difficult to argue with. The Bronson's private assessment of Winner, as described by people who knew him well, was one of sustained and genuine dislike that the commercial results did not meaningfully soften. Lee Marvin and Charles Bronson were both products of a specific generation of American masculinity, men who had served in the military, who had known real hardship, and who brought to their screen work an authenticity that actors who had not shared those experiences found genuinely difficult to replicate. They occupied overlapping professional spaces for years, appeared together in The Dirty Dozen in 1967, alongside a cast of some of the most formidable screen presences of that era. and were frequently discussed in the same breath by critics and audiences trying to articulate what made the American action film of the late 1960s feel different from what had come before. But the similarity of their backgrounds and professional profiles did not produce warmth between them. It produced something closer to competitive tension, and in Bronson's case, a specific and documented frustration with what he perceived as Marvin's willingness to coast on natural ability and cultural authority in situations where Bronson believed more disciplined preparation was both possible and required. Marvin's drinking was a factor that everyone who worked with him during his most active years had to account for, and Bronson, who was himself disciplined about his physical condition and his professional preparation in ways that people on his sets consistently noted, found the unreliability that Marvin's drinking sometimes produced on set genuinely difficult to accept. There was also a competitive dimension that went beyond professional conduct. Both men were competing for a relatively narrow category of roles during the late 1960s and 1970s. The weathered, physically authoritative, morally complex action hero and the industry's decisions about which of them to cast in specific projects created an ongoing awareness of each other's professional position that was not always comfortable. Bronson was candid with people he trusted about his feeling that Marvin received credit and opportunities that were not always commensurate with the discipline and preparation he actually brought to the work. That assessment was pointed, and it was not one he made only privately. Steve McQueen is perhaps the most discussed and most documented entry on this list, because the tension between Bronson and McQueen was open enough and sustained enough that it became part of the documented record of that generation of Hollywood filmmaking rather than simply a matter of private complaint. The two men appeared together in The Great Escape in 1963, a production that brought together an extraordinary collection of male screen talent and that created in the process a set of competitive dynamics that were visible and discussed at the time rather than only in retrospect. McQueen's behavior on The Great Escape set was driven by a consuming need to be the dominant presence in every scene and in every conversation about the film. He was acutely aware of his own star value and relentlessly strategic about protecting and extending it, in ways that included lobbying for script changes that would increase his screen time, resisting scenes in which other actors might register as strongly as he did, and generally operating with a self-interest that was not particularly concealed behind professional courtesy. The other actors on that production found this dynamic wearing in varying degrees. Bronson found it, by multiple accounts, genuinely contemptible. Bronson had come from a world where the kind of aggressive self-promotion that McQueen practiced was associated with a certain kind of dishonesty, with people who pushed themselves forward at the expense of the group rather than contributing to something shared. His background had given him a specific set of values about collective effort and about the claims that individual ambition was allowed to make on shared resources. And McQueen's behavior on that set violated those values in ways that Bronson did not bother to conceal from people he trusted. He found McQueen's talent real and his conduct unacceptable, and he held both of those assessments simultaneously without apparent difficulty. The two men crossed professional paths again in subsequent years, and the dynamic between them did not significantly improve with time or distance. People who observed them in the same professional contexts during the 1960s and 1970s described a mutual wariness that had calcified into something more settled and less likely to shift. Bronson's assessment of McQueen, as reported by people close to him, was that his talent was genuine and his character was not, a distinction that Bronson made clearly and that he was willing to express directly when the context invited it. He was not interested in softening that assessment out of professional courtesy, and he did not. The distinction between what McQueen could do on screen and what he was willing to be off it remained, for Bronson, one of the more telling examples of the gap that could exist between ability and integrity in the same person. The friction between Charles Bronson and the specific category of actor who arrived on set treating the work as a vehicle for personal expression rather than as a shared professional commitment is a pattern that appeared consistently enough across his career to deserve its own discussion. James Coburn is the figure whose name comes up most frequently in this context, and the circumstances that produce the tension between them are worth understanding in some detail. Coburn and Bronson shared The Magnificent Seven in 1960, one of the landmark ensemble westerns in American film history, and they appeared together in other contexts across the subsequent decade. Coburn was a genuinely distinctive talent, physically striking, charismatic, and possessed of a comedic timing that complemented his action credentials in ways that made him unusually versatile. He was also, by the accounts of people who worked with him during his most prominent years, someone who could be deeply self-involved on set in ways that affected his availability for the collaborative give and take that ensemble work requires. Bronson's approach to ensemble work was rooted in a clear sense of collective obligation. You prepared, you showed up ready, you served the scene rather than yourself. He had little patience for what he perceived as actors using a shared production as a platform for individual performance rather than genuine collaboration, and Coburn's style of working, which tended toward the expansive and the personally expressive, created friction with Bronson's more disciplined and collective sensibility. People who worked with both men have described Bronson's private comments about Coburn as carrying a genuine edge. Not simple professional criticism, but something closer to a fundamental disagreement about what professional conduct actually required. The tension was compounded by the competitive dimension that ran through most of Bronson's relationships with peers of comparable profile and talent. He was not someone who found competition energizing or clarifying. He found it wearing, particularly when the people he was competing with did not appear to bring to that competition the same discipline and seriousness that he himself brought. Coburn's more relaxed approach to the work, more willing to let things find themselves in the moment, less concerned with the kind of rigorous advanced preparation that Bronson practiced, was something Bronson read less as a different working method and more as a failure of professional commitment. Eli Wallach appeared alongside Bronson in several productions across the 1960s and belonged to the generation of New York theater-trained actors who brought to Hollywood films a set of assumptions about craft and process that were grounded in the actor's studio tradition and in the specific culture of serious stage work. Wallach was a talented and dedicated performer whose film work across several decades demonstrated a genuine range and a consistent commitment to finding something real in every role he played. He was, by most accounts, a thoughtful and collegial professional who took his responsibilities to fellow cast members seriously. The friction with Bronson was therefore less about Wallach's conduct on set than about a more fundamental disagreement about the nature of screen acting and what it was supposed to require from its practitioners. Wallach's training and his professional identity were built around a specific approach to character, psychologically complex, emotionally exploratory, grounded in the kind of internal excavation that the actor studio method emphasized. Bronson's approach was built on economy, on physical presence, on the precise and disciplined delivery of performance through externally controlled means rather than internal emotional excavation. Both approaches were legitimate. They were also genuinely incompatible in their underlying assumptions about what acting was and what it was supposed to produce. Bronson's private assessments of actors whose training and method differed significantly from his own were not always charitable, and Wallach's very visible identification with a tradition that Bronson found overcomplicated and somewhat pretentious created a specific friction that people close to Bronson noticed and described. He was not someone who confused methodological difference with personal failing. He was intelligent enough to recognize the distinction. But he was also not someone who went out of his way to respect approaches he found fundamentally at odds with his own convictions about what screen acting actually required, and his feelings about the actor's studio tradition and about the specific people most closely identified with it were not uniformly positive. The relationship between Charles Bronson and the studio system, specifically his experience of the way major Hollywood studios managed the careers and images of actors who did not fit the conventional profile of marketable stardom, is the final entry on this list, and it is perhaps the most important one for understanding the full picture of his professional life. Bronson spent a significant portion of his early and middle career being passed over for roles that were given to actors whose profiles were more conventionally appealing to the studio's commercial calculations, and the experience left marks on his attitude toward institutional Hollywood that never fully healed. The specific people who embodied what Bronson found most objectionable about this system were the studio executives and producers who made those casting decisions, and whose criteria for evaluating talent he found both commercially short-sighted and personally insulting. Bronson did not fit the physical or temperamental template that 1950s and early 1960s Hollywood applied to leading men. He was too rough, too foreign-looking, too unpolished in ways that the studio system of that era found difficult to package for mainstream audiences. He watched actors whom he believed were significantly less talented than him receive opportunities that were denied to him on the basis of criteria that had nothing to do with the actual quality of what either of them brought to the work. The bitterness that this experience produced in Bronson was real and lasting. He spoke about it in interviews with a directness that most actors in his position would have moderated for strategic reasons, and the anger underneath those statements was not performed or exaggerated for effect. By the time European producers recognized what American studios had been passing over and cast him in the films that made him an international star, he had accumulated a decade's worth of experience with an institutional culture that evaluated people by criteria he found both wrong and demeaning, and that institutional culture never fully recovered its credibility in his eyes regardless of what it subsequently offered him. The most honest summary of Charles Bronson's professional dislikes is not a list of personal enemies, but a map of the values he held, and the specific ways those values brought him into conflict with the world he inhabited. He believed in preparation and found coasting unacceptable. He believed in collective professional obligation and found individual grandstanding contemptible. He believed in straight dealing and found the performance of warmth that concealed real indifference or real contempt actively dishonest in a way he could not bring himself to respect or accommodate. He had grown up in a world where these qualities were not abstract principles, but practical necessities, where the gap between what you claimed to be and what you actually were could have consequences that were serious and physical and real. And he never fully shed the standards that world had given him, regardless of how far the film industry moved him from its geography and its hardships. The people on this list frustrated or genuinely troubled him because they represented, in various ways, failures of those standards. Failures of preparation, of honesty, of collective obligation, of the basic respect for the work that he believed everyone involved in a production owed to everyone else involved in it. He was not wrong about those failures in most cases. He was also not always easy to work alongside himself, and the people who found him difficult would not have been entirely without a point in saying so. His directness was real, but it could also be a blunt instrument, and the line between honest professional assessment and simple interpersonal difficulty was not always one he drew carefully or consistently. But the picture that emerges from looking at these relationships honestly is not of a man defined by his dislikes. It is of a man defined by his commitments, and whose dislikes were simply the shadow that those commitments cast when the world failed to live up to them. That is a more complicated and more genuinely interesting thing to be, and it is closer to the truth of who Charles Bronson actually was than any simpler account would manage to capture.